My name is Matthew Jones. I'm the Environmental Impact Assessment Manager for the Westport program. And today we're going to talk a little bit about our referral to the Environmental Protection Agency and talk through some of the work that they're going to be doing. Environmental Protection Authority is the correct term. And we will talk through some of what that looks like and what is included in the referral. This first slide is about the process we anticipate. And if you joined our webinar a few weeks ago, we kind of talked through the EPA process and kind of how that works. And I think the key underpinning of all of that is that ultimately this is the EPA's assessment process. This is their decisions about how they go about assessing the project, and that's based to a certain degree on the referral. So when we say we anticipate this being the process, this is our knowledge and experience based on other projects and what we think this project will undertake. But again, all of these decisions are ultimately under the jurisdiction of the EPA, and they will make these decisions ultimately. So currently we're in the middle of the 7-day public comment period on our referral to the EPA. That will close next Tuesday, 25th of March. From there, we believe we will enter into a scoping process on a public environmental review process. We believe that the scoping document will be made public. And again, that's their decision, but we think the scoping process will warrant a certain amount of public input. And from there, once that assessment framework is determined, we'll go away and we'll do a lot of work, and we'll come back sometime in the middle of 2025. And we think somewhere in the range of 8 to 12 weeks, probably closer to 12 weeks, all of the environmental review documentation will be made public for that PER process. And then that will inform the EPA's assessment and their draft recommendations to the Minister for Environment. The minister will then and only then make a decision. And once appeals, if there is appeals on the assessment, following that process, they would make a decision. If the Commonwealth goes through a bilateral assessment process, which is what we hope to do, then following a decision by the state environmental minister, that would be followed by a decision by the Commonwealth Minister for Environment on the Commonwealth's environmental assessment process. So that's where we think we're going in the general trajectory of the project and the assessment process. So what we're talking about, though, is where we sit as of today. So a couple of weeks ago, we provided the documents themselves to the EPA. They made those available for public comment starting this Tuesday, again, running through next Tuesday, the 25th. Referral is really asking a couple of key questions. The first one is, should the project be assessed? At what level should that project be assessed? And then it asks kind of an open question around concerns, values. One of the things the EPA is doing with this process is determining what are the key environmental factors associated with this proposal. And that really informs the assessment process. And some of the open commentary that you're allowed to provide really can help inform the public's concerns and where that assessment might go. So given the significance of the project and where we sit currently in the project development process, we have actually asked the EPA, or at least recommended to the EPA, that we believe this project warrants that highest level of assessment and warrants undertaking a full public environmental review. So, and again, maybe I'll note, when you open it up, that is the cover of the document. And if you go to the EPA's website and look under search for proposals, we're the first in the queue now because we're the most recent referral. So stepping back a little bit about the Westport program unto itself. So the Westport program, as it was announced at the end of last year in terms of a preferred option for Westport, Westport includes a number of projects being delivered by a number of agencies, which are meant to set the framework for a full supply chain that can functionally replace the Port of Fremantle. And there's a lot of aspects to that. Obviously, there's a lot of constraints within the context of Fremantle, not just in terms of the port itself, but in terms of road and rail connectivity and just the infrastructure that really supports the port. And this decision-making around the moving of the port has really been focused on delivering that full supply chain so the port can function optimally. The referral that we have made to the EPA is for the infrastructure that will belong ultimately to that port authority in terms of the actual port footprint itself and the access channels that allow ships to come into that port. And so that is really, when we look at this, the term DE that you see on the side here, that is the development envelope, and it is an envelope bigger than the physical project itself, but encompasses all of the activities that we're proposing to the EPA and the Commonwealth that will constitute this proposal or proposed action. So it does cover a substantial amount of area. As I noted, it covers the shipping channels that come down from the deep water access into what is now Fremantle. So this is the existing deep water access. You will note there's a fairly sharp turn for ships coming down and then entering Fremantle. What we are proposing for the size of ships, for the class of ships we anticipate coming to Fremantle or coming down to the new port in the future, we're creating a little bit of a bend in that channel, and it's requiring some additional dredging all the way down and through Success and Parmelia Banks into the deeper waters of Coburn Sound. And when ships come up into the port facility, there will again be newer access channels. These really sit on the Kwinana Shelf, and so there's some additional dredging adjacent to the port footprint itself. And I'll talk about this port footprint a little bit. One of the things you'll note on this is that there's existing channels through Success and Parmelia Banks. These are sand banks that come across the waterway here. In between, there is a body of water called Owen Anchorage. What we're proposing is a second channel that comes into that area. There's a couple of reasons for this, and they are explained in the referral document. Widening the older channels in the first instance actually results in greater impacts on seagrass. So this second channel goes through some areas where there has been dredging for other projects for sand reclamation and other things that have gone in the past. So by moving the second channel through these areas, we go through areas that are generally already impacted, and it minimizes the amount of impacts we have on seagrass, which is a topic we'll talk about a little bit later. Again, noting here that the referral for the Environmental Protection Act to the EPA is in. We are anticipating having referral documents with the Commonwealth in the next few weeks by the end of this month. And then we anticipate sometime following that referral to the Commonwealth would then also make their documents public and make a decision on their assessment process. So moving to the next slide. So a little bit about the context of the proposal, and this is probably one of the key early sections of the referral that is material and important for people to read through and kind of understand what it is we are proposing. Again, I showed you the deeper water access channel as it comes through open water and into Coburn Sound. And now we're showing a little bit detail around the port facility itself. So one of the things you will note is we're adding a large reclamation area adjacent to the existing Kwinana industrial area that will form the mass of the port. And so this new land we're reclaiming is all generated through that dredged material. Again, one of the key things we want to do is minimize the amount of material that has to be disposed of somewhere. So again, we're placing most of that material into the reclamation footprint itself. And if we have excess material, either that may be material that for various reasons is completely unsuitable that we do have to place somewhere else, or it may be beneficial reuse of sand material that we can use if it's appropriate for beach nourishment or other processes that have benefits. So in talking through some of the key characteristics, this is obviously a fairly large reclamation footprint. As you can see along the edge of the Kwinana industrial area, this is probably more than 2.5 kilometers across. The breakwater itself is 2.6 kilometers long. And again, the adjacent access channels are fairly substantial and come onto the shelf. You can see a little bit of the bathymetry of the sound itself, deeper water off here, transitioning into shallow water on the Kwinana shelf. Another important point is the dredging. At the point of referral, we are noting that we may dredge up to 35 million cubic meters of material. Now, that's not an insignificant number by any stretch. But again, at this stage, what we are assuming is the maximum project extent based on a variety of factors. At this stage in the program, we're only at about 15% design, and so there's still a few unknowns. And what we hope is, as we progress through the assessment process, we'll be able to minimize some of those footprints, bring certain areas in, refine that as we gain knowledge through the designing process and through the environmental process, and really start to narrow down and focus in on the project. Again, there may be some future maintenance dredging associated with this program, but this is a fairly early stage. That's not something we would necessarily get approved by the EPA in this round, and it's probably something down the line, once the port's constructed, we would gain a better understanding of how channels are filling in, of what the requirements are, and then think through what a maintenance dredging program looks like. So when we think through the context, and again, this is something we talk about in the referral, is how we've come to select the port. Something that's really important to the EPA is the decision-making process and the alternatives you've considered along the way in trying to define the port. The proposal we've referred, again, is the basis or comes from a fairly long process of refining the project and coming to a decision on how we proceed. Stage one of the Westport program was really about looking at the need, looking at the viability of Fremantle and its constraints, and really looking at kind of what the problem was and what was necessary to solve that problem. Stage two looked at a variety of options in terms of staying at Fremantle in part for a period of time, potentially moving the facility down to Coburn Sound, and also options at Bunbury. Ultimately, the decision was made that for the long-term best path forward, moving container trade in whole to Kwinana was the best suitable option. And that defined an initial kind of location and road connection into that location that would service a new port. So what we've done in stage three, which has covered the last year and a bit, is really take that decision from stage two and then start to refine what that port footprint looks like. Again, now that we've got this decision around where it goes, there's optimization you can do in terms of that footprint and thinking through some of the environmental factors, some of the logistical factors, and other aspects of the project that come into what's called a multi-criteria analysis that really interrogates some of those options for the port and helps the team decide on the best port option. And this process is talked about over a number of pages in the referral document and really kind of lays out the decision-making and some of the decision-making thinking that went into selecting the preferred alternative, which has become the proposal that we've referred to the EPA. So In terms of this last stage of design, again, I won't talk so much about, the IMT, the land side options, because those are, again, different pieces of infrastructure. A lot of the intermodal terminals will ultimately be delivered by private entities potentially. And again, they're not really the port infrastructure that a port authority would have control over at the end of the day. And so through this process and this multi-criteria analysis we've gone through a series of stages where we've taken 30 high-level options, done a certain amount of work to refine those down, mostly qualitative, got down to a long list of 7 designs that we interrogated a little bit more fully, started to look at quantitative criteria, started to make measurements and compare some of those options down to 3 design options where we actually did a fair amount of work, and in the environmental phase looked at impacts on benthic habitat, hydrodynamic modeling, potential impacts on the circulation and water through the sound and how it impacts snapper spawning and other factors to really find a design and an option for the port that was the most or the least environmentally impactful and that avoided as many potential impacts as we possibly could. And again, we'll talk to this a little bit once we get into kind of the environmental topics. But this section really sets a little bit of that scene for when we discuss the environmental factors. Another key aspect of this is the cumulative framework. So cumulative impact assessment is really important in terms of understanding all of the things that are happening in the sound, how this potential project would contribute to those impacts, and just when considered together, what are the potential environmental impacts of a number of projects proposed. One of the projects we definitely know about is the Water Corporation's potential duplication of the desalination plant in Kwinana. That sits very proximate. If you look at some of that footprint identified up there, some of the proposed port would actually overlap that. That's an effort we are going through with the Water Corporation right now to try and figure out how to manage those impacts, how to protect those assets, and really find a future path forward, but also to consider the impacts of both proposals in combination. And again, Australian Naval Infrastructure has announced the likelihood that there will be a large vessel project at the Henderson dry docks. That proposal is not fully defined. We don't know what that looks like, but we definitely anticipate that is a project that is coming and will need to be considered. And there's other infrastructure going on, potential naval infrastructure at Stirling on Garden Island that may require further consideration. And so we're starting to lay out that picture of what we think the full cumulative impact assessment looks like. Additionally, stakeholder engagement, very important. We've done a lot of it through all the stages of Westport. I think this really starts to describe some of the work we've done. But again, this is really just a very high level picture of a ton of work our communications team has done in the background. So now we get to kind of the meat of the referral. And this is really an important outline of each of the key environmental factors that we believe the EPA will assess the project on. And the page numbers there are the page numbers at which you will find all of these sections within the document. And they start to lay out where we're at. And each of these sections will have a very standard similar format where they will talk about what the EPA considers this factor to be and what what the essence is of the objective it's trying to obtain, what the policy is and the guidance that underpins that factor, what the environment is associated with that factor, both within the footprint and surrounding the footprint, the potential environmental impacts. And again, this is a key section. of what we think might be the potential environmental impacts of this proposal within the context of that factor. And then through some of the mitigation, avoidance, management options that we will be considering. And then it has a couple of sections that we will really more fully explore when we do the public environmental review in terms of assessing the full significance of those impacts and making determinations around environmental outcomes. Now, at referral of this project, we've included those sections, but we really don't get deep into that discussion of it because, again, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We are anticipating this public environmental review, and we know that we're going to have to do a lot of work to feed into that environmental review. So kind of walking through these, we're assuming we will be assessed on 9 factors. This reflects all of the EPA's marine factors and some of the terrestrial factors and other factors that we will consider. So benthic communities and habitats, that includes reefs, seagrass, really the bottom of the seafloor and the habitat that exists there. Coastal processes, sand movement along the shoreline, erosion, all of those aspects. Marine environmental quality is hopefully fairly self-explanatory. It's the quality of the water, but also in the context of the project, it will be the circulation, the amount of flushing within Coburn Sound is a very important aspect, and really some of the water quality around potential turbidity and dredging program turbidity that may occur during the construction of the port. Marine fauna talks through protected fauna, both at a state and federal level, and then through fisheries that are important for recreational aspects and commercial aspects. Flora and vegetation, if you think back to that footprint for the port, we do extend into the landside area of the Kwinana industrial area. There are some areas of vegetation. That vegetation does have habitat aspects, does have floristic aspects that we will consider that are important in the flora and vegetation section, but then also provide habitat as we consider it in the terrestrial fauna section. Terrestrial environmental quality, this talks about the quality of that terrestrial environment. One of the key aspects here, given that we are in the Kwinana industrial area, given that there is past history of contamination, is that contamination in aspect and appropriate management of it. When we talk about inland waters, we don't have any wetlands within the footprint or streams, but we definitely have a groundwater aspect, and that groundwater aspect is very material to the marine side of the project. Social surroundings, this covers recreational aspects. That's very important and not mentioned underneath there, but also Aboriginal heritage, historical heritage, including marine historical heritage, noise aspects, visual and aesthetic aspects, and potential air quality aspects as they relate to sensitive receivers in surrounding communities. And I get my slide to move forward. So when we talk about all these aspects and where we start to lay out these sections, we talk about the potential impacts. And when we think about potential impacts, we're thinking about something called the mitigation hierarchy. And this really looks at how we take the potential significant impacts that we think are associated with this proposal and how we describe that process of avoiding those impacts, which is where the history of decision-making, where that multi-criteria analysis and the tools we use to make those decisions becomes important. But then also how we think through minimization of impacts, and then other things we can do in terms of rehabilitation. And then if we can't manage our impacts under all of those other aspects, how we think about offsets and offsetting our impact on the environment. One of the reasons we talk a lot about that multi-criteria analysis in the referral document is because that avoidance phase is really, really important for us. The more we can avoid at this stage in the process, early on, while we're selecting port sites, the less we have to do in that minimization, rehab, and offsetting space. What we would like to do is do things in the offsetting space, such as rehabilitation of seagrasses and restoration of seagrasses, that really goes above and beyond the requirements of this project. And we would like to do some things that have positive net benefits to the environment of Coburn Sound. And the more we can do in that avoidance phase, the more we can do that works into that net gain space. And that's a really important consideration for this project. One of the things that informs how we're starting to think about this, and this relates to that benthic habitat and communities factor, is the work we're doing under the Walmsley Science Program. And this is a partnership with the West Australian Marine Science Institute that involves a number of local universities doing projects across a whole wide range of environmental endeavors that really inform the marine environment of Coburn Sound. One of those is benthic habitat mapping for the whole of the project, including within Coburn Sound. You can see the map of the benthic mapping we've been doing to date. We've now got that down to about a species level in terms of seagrasses, and we're really starting to do a lot of work. And there's been a lot of effort that the University of Western Australia has done and with other partners to really bring this project to bear and start to do this benthic habitat mapping. And that's something we do discuss in the referral and start to lay out in terms of the avoidance we've done as part of this project. Again, here you can see on the picture the benthic habitats as mapped against the footprint. When you look at this and you look at that development down in the Coburn Sound Assessment Unit, and these are the assessment units that the EPA uses for assessing benthic habitat, the perennial seagrasses that exist within that development envelope, well, there aren't any perennial seagrasses within that development envelope. And that's really an effort that's gone into the outcome that's come from the work we did in that MCA process. Now, some of the dredging work we will do, some of the construction of the port could create turbidity that goes beyond that boundary. And we have to put a lot of thought into how we manage that. But we really want to put a lot of effort into minimizing those things. And the avoidance we've been able to do, moving the port from the south to the south from where the location was identified in stage 2, is a really key aspect of that. So kind of bringing it back to what we're asking for, or what the EPA is asking for with this public vetting of the referral, is really about how we move forward. These are the questions you will be asked, and they're really around how this should be assessed. Now, as I said at the beginning, we've already asked the EPA and requested that this be undertaken by public environmental review. We think that is warranted given the scale of the project and where we are. But I think it's a good thing because once we get through this stage, we are going to move into a scoping process. And so the more feedback we can get to the EPA, the input provided to the EPA by our stakeholders really allows the EPA to gauge where they need the assessment to go and what potential things they may want to bring in to inform that assessment. And so it's a really key part of the process, and it's really about people's voices being heard and meaningfully interacting with the way the assessment works. And with that, that's my presentation, and we're happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Just while we're waiting for any questions to come through, I can see some people are madly typing, which is great. And I would encourage anyone and everyone, please, to send through your questions while we've got Matthew. I guess just while we're waiting for those first questions, Matthew, I'm thinking, referral is the first stage of this process. And obviously there's a public comment period associated with referral. Perhaps you could just map out the process and any other public comment periods that we can expect throughout this process.
Other public comment periods we expect, as I noted, we expect to move into a scoping process. Scoping documents can be made public. Sometimes they're not made public. We would expect this one to be public. Again, that's EPA's decision, but we do think that that's probably the next point to interact and really form an opinion on how that assessment is done. Then we're probably waiting until the longer period during public environmental review, when those big documents become available, to really talk through that process. And from there, we will do a response to submissions on those public comments on the PER process. Often days with complex assessments, those are made public as well. That certainly could happen with this project. And I note I've got the chat up so I can kind of see some of the questions. The 7-day comment period is short, and that's definitely something that's by statute. It's a requirement that goes all the way back to the origins of the Act in 1986. So it's really something, I agree, it is short, but it's really only around making that decision, should this be assessed? And in today's environment, yes, referrals can be very complex and long documents. We've tried to make it as tight and as light and as focused as possible. And that's still a 230-page document. And that's a lot to try and review in a week. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this consultation today, is to really kind of help give people a roadmap so they can meaningfully try and cover it, or get to topics that they think are important so they can really best comment on the process.
There's a question there about maintenance dredging, Matthew, and just asking for some kind of comparison between what's currently happening at the Port of Fremantle and what would be proposed in Kwinana. I mean, is it similar? Is it more or less?
Again, it's hard to know at this stage. And I think one of the things I would go back to, and we're starting to look at some of those processes, I actually suspect it's going to be less. We don't fully know that. There's a couple of reasons why I suspect it may be less. And those are meaningful to talk about. I think one of the things I talked about is there is existing channels. The key areas of sedimentation are those two big sand banks, Success and Parmelia Bank. That's ultimately sand that's moving towards the coastline. So it's an important aspect of the environment. And there's already an existing channel through it. And as I described, there's a large amount of impact in other areas of those banks that have taken sediment out of those banks. I think in both cases, the sediment that would fall into that second channel is often getting intercepted by that first channel, and then those other impact areas that will sit in line with our existing channel. Now, we have to do a ton of work around modeling this, making sure these pieces come together, and we will do that work and present it in the PER. But I think where we're headed is a scenario where the maintenance dredging isn't going to be that complex. In terms of at the port facility itself in Coburn Sound, we know that those channels, there's existing channels there already that come into the bulk terminal that exists in Coburn Sound. We know from Frio ports that those channels have never had to be dredged. And so I think we have a high level of confidence based on that history that within the port footprint itself, we're probably not doing a lot of maintenance dredging in the future.
There's another question that's come through regarding offsets and whether the offsets would be limited to only seagrass related activities, or are there other initiatives that we're considering?
Not necessarily. I think seagrass is the one I mentioned because it will probably be the biggest piece of the puzzle. But again, there's a state environmental policy that governs Coburn Sound. There's a long history of water quality aspects that are important. There are other initiatives that we are exploring. I would say we have a wide range of opportunities, from water quality initiatives, from habitat initiatives that may not just be limited to seagrass. and other aspects that we're working through that we're going to try and pin down as we move forward to bring to bear. And some of those may not be offsets. They may be things we do as part of the project to manage impacts or other aspects of the project. In terms of land side, if some of that vegetation ends up being either state priority or federally threatened, we would have to do some offsets around that. But again, those are things we will need to work through as part of the assessment.
Another question there about the impact of redevelopment of existing port in an urban development. Is that counted as an effect of Westport?
No, it isn't from the EPA's context. The EPA will assess that. If warranted, the EPA would assess that as its own proposal, as its own project. The way we are thinking about it, ultimately, when we think about the effects of Westport, we are thinking about the direct environmental impacts from the construction and operation of that port unto itself. But again, that cumulative aspect of other projects nearby that interact with us and have potential impacts on the environment, those are very material. Excellent questions. Thank you.
Please keep sending through questions if you've got them. Just while we're waiting, Matthew, I wonder if we might jump to the next slide. I can talk through some of the next steps and some of the other activities that are happening, I guess, around this process. So we have a survey that's currently open. I guess what we're talking about here is a statutory process that's run by the EPA. So we don't want to muddy the waters there. But I guess if you've got direct feedback for Westport and you've got questions that you would like to direct to us, then I just wanted to talk through some of the channels and avenues that are open to you. We have a community survey that's open until the 31st of March. We've also got a specific survey that's for those people who ride horses down at the Naval Base Horse Beach. So both of those surveys are available on our website, and there's a link available in front of you now. I'm also conscious that for some people, using the chat function isn't the most friendly. So if you would rather have a face-to-face conversation with us, then we're going to be out in the community over the coming weeks, and we have been, for the last few months. So coming up next, we're going to be down at the Rockingham Shopping Centre this Saturday. We've also got another follow-up webinar that's happening on the 23rd of April. And what we'll be digging into there are really the top questions or the hot topics that we're picking up from community. So I would encourage people to complete the survey, to get in touch with us. We have an email address as well, which is inquiries@westport.wa.gov.au. So if you have questions, send them through, and we'll use that session to address the things that are of most interest to you. We also have all the previous webinars available on our YouTube channel. So there's a link there as well. Just another minute or so to see if there's any follow-up questions. But if not, happy to leave it there. Again, I'll say thank you to Matthew. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in. And yeah, look, we look forward to providing more information. I think it's such a huge program of work that we rely on community feedback. We rely on feedback to tell us what's of interest to you. What is it that you want to know about this program? That will help us really hone into the topics that are of most interest. So again, encourage you to complete the survey, send through your feedback, and we'll do our best to address the things that you're interested in. Great. Thanks, everyone. I think we'll wrap it up there. Really appreciate it. Thanks all.
Thanks.